Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I come to you today to talk a little bit about a reading project that I want to participate in. It's been a weird couple of months for me. I've been distracted by the news, of course, but I've also been really busy, which I don't fully understand, and I've had less quiet time in my now full house. That last one has meant more good company, more interesting cooking experiments, and birthday parties. 3 out of the 4 of us have April birthdays. But it does mean I've read a bit less, and books are harder to come by these days. I have a ridiculous number of books ready to read on my shelves. I have a couple of huge bags of library books, too. And since I use 2 different library systems, I also have access to a lot of books digitally. Unfortunately, when a read-along comes along and I start craving particular books, I often can't get those without paying more for them than I'm prepared to pay at the moment. That was certainly an issue for this upcoming reading month, Mostly Midrash, hosted by Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, Felicia at Little Prairie Library, and Steve Donahue. They've inspired me to come up with a huge list of possibilities, but I only plan to read 2 of the books of my possibilities list, in keeping with the Mostly Midrash plan of reading 1 fiction and 1 nonfiction work. Midrash has been on my mind a lot lately. I'm a secular Jew, drawn to a certain level of observance as a way to connect with history, but fundamentally a non-believer. Every spring, my family celebrates Passover, eating matzah, horseradish, sweet haroset made from fruits and nuts, and more eggs than you can imagine. Many years ago, my spouse and I put together a modern Haggadah, a service we read during a night or 2 of Passover over our meal. Our Haggadah is full of progressive politics and liberal theology, quotes from Gandhi and Zora Neale Hurston and Emma Goldman, and the work of historians of slavery in the United States and Jewish feminist scholars who analyze both religious texts and religious practice across the world. And we also talk a fair amount about both traditional and modern midrash, such as feminist midrash, imaginative reconstructions of or additions to biblical stories. Additions that are also reflections of our own contemporary experiences or our beliefs. At least in Jewish parlance, faith is all about wrestling with God. Midrash, a way to wrestle with a text, can make the Bible speak to the present day, even for non-believers. Well, this reading project, Maybe Midrash, doesn't require that we read what would strictly be called midrash. But the read-along does ask us to consider literary works and serious nonfiction that try to explore or build on the deep meanings of religious texts or practices or of faith in general. Given my own anxiety right now, I almost decided not to participate. I've not done well at all keeping up with my booktube commitments lately. I completely dropped the Hermione Lee biography of Virginia Woolf from my list in March. I basically didn't participate in the Voxer discussion of Mariah Edgeworth's Belinda. And even though I loved Laura Dassau-Wall's biography of Thoreau and did participate a bit in the group discussion, I didn't call in or write in nearly as much as I had intended. So that was strike 1. The second problem is that I was very excited to read some Flannery O'Connor. She's long been one of my favorite authors, along with Eudora Welty. Watching Noah at Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse, Una and Crypto at Codex Cantina, and Christie at Dostoevsky in Space talk about O'Connor really got me excited. I read and reread Flannery O'Connor short stories pretty regularly, but I haven't picked up her first novel, Wise Blood, in many years, and I thought I might read it this month, along with O'Connor's recently published A Prayer Journal. The Habit of Being, a big collection of Flannery O'Connor's letters, which I read when I was about 20 years old, is one of my all-time favorite books, opening me up to a greater diversity of ideas and thinking than I had really understood before. Wise Blood is the story of Hazel Motes, a man who tries to imagine a world other than the Calvinist world surrounding him. In his efforts to break away, he forms the Church Without Christ, arguing that sin and redemption are just fictions. As you might imagine, if you've read any Flannery O'Connor at all, things don't turn out well. Well, despite the fact that Wise Blood and most of O'Connor's work is about evangelical Protestantism in the South, she herself was a strong Catholic, and a thoughtful, though fierce one, which really shows in her letters. Fairly recently, the prayer journal was found among her letters, one she kept in the 1940s while living in Iowa. She kept the journal during those same years that she was drafting Wise Blood, and her entries are apparently often about her desire to be an author. She never separates that desire from her commitment to Catholicism and to God. As she says to God in her journal, she wants her own writing to be, quote, the instrument for your story. I was really eager to get my hands on my library's copy of this book, but it's not available to me from the digital collections. I also really wanted to look at a couple of studies of O'Connor, explicitly about the role of religious faith in her writing. One is Jordan Cofer's Gospel of Flannery O'Connor, examining the role of the Bible in Flannery O'Connor's fiction, a book which considers how she used not just her Catholicism, but, as the title says, specifically the Bible itself in her stories and novels. Wildly, that part of the equation hasn't really been investigated. At least from the descriptions I've heard, Cofer Study really is showing how Flannery O'Connor thought of her work as a kind of midrash. Sounds fascinating. And until my library opens its doors and its physical shelves again, I'm afraid I won't be reading it. The other related study is A Subversive Gospel, Flannery O'Connor and the Reimagining of Beauty, Goodness, and Truth by Michael Mears Bruner, arguing that she turned ideas about beauty and goodness on their heads as she tried to find a way to follow the radical path of Jesus. This study is written not by a literary scholar, but by a theologian, and I can imagine that it might be addressing questions that are perhaps different from the ones I want to ask, but I am intrigued. The idea of turning goodness on its head is certainly an unavoidable idea in her stories, and of course that book is also inaccessible to me at the moment. So, for my Maybe Midrash list of possibilities, I've turned to books I can access, or in a couple of cases, books I already have on my home shelves. The first set are two books utterly different from Flannery O'Connor. Both are books about women and Judaism. The first is the novel The Weight of Ink by Rachel Kaddish. This is a double narrative, the story of two women separated by generations. One is a scribe for a blind rabbi in the 1660s, bright as a plague at their city of London, incidentally. The other character is an older academic, a woman who studies Jewish history and historical texts, and who begins an investigation which leads to the female scribe. The setup sounds like an echo of A.S. Byatt's Possession, a book I loved when my spouse and I read it together way back at the beginning of our relationship. I do hope the similarity will be a good thing and not something that leads to unpleasant comparisons. If I choose this book, I think I will pair it with the nonfiction work If All the Seas Were Ink by Iland Kurshin. It's the memoir of an Israeli woman in her late 20s who's decided to study the Talmud, the early rabbinical collection of texts which established Jewish law. In most traditional communities, men study Talmud, but women don't. The author decides to learn, quote, daf yomi. That is, she'll study a small section every day of the set of texts that make up the Talmud. Reading daf yomi style is a 7.5-year process, and while Kurshin engages with the Talmud over those years, she also talks about reading literature more broadly, about marriage and motherhood, mental health, faith, about her entire surrounding life. Much to my surprise, the book is available through my library's digital platform, so it's a serious contender for my Maybe Midrash TBR. There are 4 other books about Judaism that I'll mention a little more quickly. One I have on my shelf and I'm eager to read sometime soon, and that's People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. Like The Weight of Ink, People of the Book tells the story of a contemporary woman investigating a very old Jewish text. The contemporary woman shares my name, Hannah, and she's looking at the Sarajevo Haggadah, the oldest illuminated Jewish text. As I mentioned earlier, a Haggadah is a volume to be read during the Passover Seder, over a meal with 4 glasses of red wine. Our own family Haggadahs are all covered with wine stains, but the Hannah of Brooks's novel finds other tiny artifacts in the binding: a white hair, a fragment of an insect wing. Based on the outlines of a true story, Brooks explores the life of the Haggadah over time. You know, as I'm talking, I'm wondering if I should move this one even higher on my list for the month. And it's already on my shelf. So, maybe. Well, another novel I would love to read at some point is the new book by the author of Let the Great World Spin, Colum McCann, and that is APIEROGON. I'm on a long whole list at my library for a digital copy of this book, another one I'm really eager to read. Rather than focusing on the meaning of faith or the connection to religious text, this novel explores the ways religion and culture can divide people, as well as unite people. It's the story of a Jewish Israeli man and a Muslim Palestinian man who, despite the tremendous differences and unbelievable conflicts between the two peoples, form an intense bond, partly based on their parallel grief as they mourn the deaths of their young children. And through their discussion, in a mostly Christian town, incidentally, they find a way to work towards healing, towards reconciliation and peace, and towards love. A nonfiction work I have immediate digital access to is Dani Shapiro's memoir, Devotion. Shapiro was raised in a mainstream Orthodox Jewish house, keeping kosher, watching her father wrap tefillin as he prayed, etc. She's turned away, but in the aftermath of 9/11, she started a greater quest to find some sort of spiritual mooring in her life. Another memoir about a Jewish woman raised in an observant Jewish house who rejects her faith is Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman. She was raised in a Hasidic Satmar community, secretly reading books by authors like Jane Austen and Louisa May Alcott. Before she was 20, she decided she had to escape from her community. Feldman's book is the inspiration for the new Netflix series, and because of that development, the digital copy of the book has an enormous waitlist. Perhaps I'll watch the film adaptation first. So all of these books, or at least the ones after Flannery O'Connor, are about Judaism. But the rest of the list are about Christianity. The first is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. I cannot believe I have not read the Gilead set of books yet, given that Robinson's Housekeeping has long been one of my very favorite books, one I've returned to again and again, and shared with many people. Maybe Midrash seems like a perfect time to get to it, and I believe that Felicia, one of the hosts of the project, has chosen it along with Rainey. If I do get to this one already on my shelves, I might pair it with the nonfiction book BALM and Gilead, a theological dialogue with Marilynne Robinson, a collection edited by Timothy Larson and Keith Johnson, a book that is currently available digitally through my library. Jason, another one of the hosts, strongly recommended the novel Fire Sermon by Jamie Quatro and gave it a review that makes it sound unmissable. Part of me wants to read it along with a reread of Madame Bovary, since both books are about women and adultery. But that's not the theme for this month. Fire Sermon is available as an audiobook from my library service. I've never been a great audiobook listener before, but it's a style that's been surprisingly effective for me the last couple of months. Jason also recommended the nonfiction Girl Meets God by Lauren Winner. I really enjoyed Winner's Mudhouse Sabbath, but I haven't read Girl Meets God or her newer book Still. I might be able to get a hold of the first one sometime this month, and if I can, it will definitely be a possibility for my list. A few more, briefly. One I cannot get my hands on until everything opens up again, including interlibrary loan, is Womanist Midrash by Gafney Wilda. She's presenting Midrash, real Midrash, about stories from the Hebrew Bible, from the perspective of African American feminism or womanism and African American preaching styles. From what I've seen, she doesn't shy away from acknowledging the problematic nature of some of the Bible. I gather she says sometimes the problem with the interpretation of the text is the text itself. The book sounds absolutely fascinating. It's not one I knew about until I stumbled across it while thinking about Maybe Midrash. Now I can't wait to get my hands on a copy. Womanist Midrash shares its deep engagement with the Bible with another book. A young white woman's perspective on the Christian Bible, Rachel Held Evans' inspired Slaying Giants, Walking on Water, and Loving the Bible Again engages in some midrash making of its own, as well as an analysis of current biblical scholarship. At the heart of the book, she's exploring her own relationship to both the text and to faith. And finally, I might read the brand new Thin Places, Essays from In Between by Jordan Kisner. Kisner's book is set up by her experience being saved by Jesus as a young girl, and then losing that faith only to re-find it, at least partially, later in her life. The book as a whole addresses other moments she sees as in between in whatever ways, when ideas or identities are posed as opposites, but actually they're continually bleeding into each other and blurring boundaries. The book sounds quite interesting and at least somewhat connected to the idea of making personal meaning, contemporary meaning, out of the texts and practices of religion. What an excellent plan, folks. Although I only intend to read 2 books, one fiction and nonfiction, y'all have me thinking about a whole new list of possibilities for TBRs coming down the path. Thanks to Jason and Steve and Felicia for organizing this month of Maybe Midrash. And thanks to all of you for joining me here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.